I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case.
I remember that evening by its temperature more than its color. The air held a metallic chill Oxford saves for hesitant months, a promise of rain that refused to declare itself. I walked from the station unhurried, letting the city offer its small consolations: wet stone, leaves clinging to railings, the soft breath of bicycles passing like thoughts one chooses not to keep. Somewhere a flute stumbled through Purcell and recovered. I envied the modesty of that recovery. The city has always been better at righting itself than I am. I had no intention of thinking about death. It prefers to arrive tidy and uninvited. Christchurch Meadow lay as it often does in recollection, the paths glistening, the grass pretending permanence. I paused at a row of shops that hide from visitors by being resolutely ordinary. The antique dealer had left his lamp burning. In the window, a mirror leaned at an angle, fractured along a deliberate diagonal, as though a patient geometer had supervised the damage. The break was clean, oddly elegant, and too certain to be accidental. A good novelist would have stopped and stared. I am not a good novelist, but I stared all the same. A woman passed behind me and said, without slowing, "That looks about right." The sentence hung like a diagnosis and followed me down the street. Rain began dutifully, performing its office. Oxford at night is for listening rather than looking. One hears the past rehearsing, the present clearing its throat. At the pub corner, a poster announced a lecture on Roman love elegy, a topic that ruins more evenings than it saves. I thought about elegy and decided it was simply tidier grief. Then I kept walking. At home, I opened a modest bottle and unfolded the paper. A brief paragraph near the court reports, economical and apologetic, recorded the death of a former lecturer in Jericho. Found dead at home, police not treating as suspicious. The phrase is a blanket spread over furniture one is tired of dusting. I read the lines again because habit, like religion, prefers repetition. The initials were familiar enough to trouble an old cupboard in my mind. H.M., classics, once St. Frid's Wides, resigned after disagreements. The tone was what it always is when intelligence falls out of favor with itself. Tidy, uncurious, grateful for closure. My crossword sulked on the arm of the chair. A clue I had left unanswered offered a dry provocation. Glass reveals double life. 6 letters. I wrote mirror and felt briefly triumphant until the letters collided with their neighbors and undid a decent corner. A mirror does not reveal a double life. It returns life dressed as likeness. I rubbed out the certainty and left the wound open. The rain fretted at the glass with the persistence of a timid solicitor. I cannot pretend the notice in the paper and the cracked mirror introduced themselves at once. My mind is slower than my impatience with it. Still, I have learned to keep the day's misfits on a mental shelf. Within reach of the hand, one extends later. I replayed the shop, the exact angle of the fracture, the dustless triangle on the sill where something had been moved. The register lying open on the counter, though the door had been locked. Someone had required a name to be seen, or required a name to be forgotten. I made a note, not on paper, but in that shabby ledger the older detectives call instinct, and I call cowardice postponed. The bottle behaved. I stood at the window and waited for the rain to finish its argument with the street. A siren approached, reconsidered, and went elsewhere. I imagined the Jericho house, not from morbidity, but because rooms become legible once their owner has left them. Books in perpendicular stacks, a kettle abandoned just before the whistle, a mirror carried from room to room like a slowed apology. I had not met the woman, yet I felt the intactness of her absence, that peculiar phenomenon which refuses explanation and therefore invites it. Lewis telephoned, or perhaps I called him. Time rearranges such courtesies. "There's a death in Jericho," he said, "probably the usual." "We might as well look," I heard myself reply. "Why?" he asked. Because the paper has been too certain, I said, and because a mirror was broken where nothing else wished to be. He sighed the way decent men sigh when they know the evening has chosen them. I put on my coat with the clumsy reverence of a man persuading himself toward purpose. Outside, the rain decided to mean it. I locked the door and listened to the city draw in its breath. The crossword kept its silence on the arm of the chair. That was all right. The best clues prefer rain and patience, and Oxford had kindly provided both. The rain had lessened by morning, though Oxford never quite remembers how to stop weeping. I arrived in Jericho while the city was still rubbing its eyes, the narrow terraces slick and self-effacing, as if ashamed of the drama the night had allowed. Lewis stood outside the house, collar raised, expression undecided. He told me the woman's name again, Dr. Helena Marwood, and I pretended not to recall it from the paper. It was the sort of name that stayed in one's mind whether one liked it or not. Inside, the house smelt faintly of burnt dust and stale perfume, that uneasy marriage of intellect and loneliness. Books everywhere, though not in disorder. She had been the kind of reader who believed shelves should confess something of their owner's soul. A cup sat unwashed on the table, its ring precise, as though the drinker had gone only to answer the door. The gas fire clicked to itself in the silence, and I felt that curious shift one feels when a place refuses to agree with its official description. This did not look like despair. It looked rehearsed. Lewis pointed out the obvious. Pills, glass. Note. I said little. The note was too cleanly written, the punctuation too careful. People who intend to die rarely remember semicolons. On the desk beside it lay a translation of Catullus, open to the same poem I'd once mangled in my youth, lines on a woman's faithlessness, her mirror image no longer matching her heart. I found myself reading it twice, as though repetition might invent a motive. When I turned the page, a word had been underlined twice. Speculum. Mirror. There it was again, waiting. Upstairs, the bedroom was the kind of space one rents to one's own solitude. A cracked mirror leaned on the mantel, reflecting the ceiling in two obedient halves. Beneath it, a cigarette had burned out in an ashtray shaped like a laurel wreath. It had not been hers. She didn't smoke. Lewis suggested she might have taken it up again. I said perhaps, though the ash told another story. Too dark, too dense. Cigar, not cigarette. The sort of thing smoked by men who are careful about their indulgences. There was a photograph on the dressing table. 4 people in academic robes, smiling the formal smile of colleagues pretending friendship. I recognized one of them, Sir Alaric Fane, warden of St. Frideswides. The dead woman stood beside him, half-turned, her gaze elsewhere, as though listening to something behind the camera. The 4th face was cropped away, and the absence felt intentional. I made a note to ask why. Downstairs again, I opened a drawer and found a postcard wedged between old receipts. A fresco of a woman holding a mirror, her reflection strangely whole despite the cracks across the paint. On the back, a single line in fine italic hand. Truth survives reflection. No signature, no address, only the Oxford postmark from a week ago. Lewis watched me frown at it. He asked whether I thought she'd had company that night. I said everyone does in one form or another. He didn't laugh. I told him to ask the neighbors about visitors, and to find out who posted the card. He said we'd find little. The case was already marked as suicide. I said that was the trouble with tidy answers. They're always adopted too soon. I sat in her chair before leaving, for reasons I could not explain to him. The window offered a view of Jericho's narrowness. Rooftops stacked like thoughts too cautious to be spoken. The books on the wall seemed to lean toward one another in quiet counsel. Somewhere outside, a bicycle bell repeated itself, lost in its own rhythm. I tried to imagine her final hour and failed. People imagine suicides as operatic gestures. Most are simply human punctuation marks, pauses mistaken for endings, but nothing in this room felt paused. It felt interrupted. Lewis returned with word from the neighbor opposite. A porter from the college had seen a man leaving late, tall, dark coat, smelt of tobacco. She'd assumed it was some friend seeing her home. I asked if she'd mentioned a time. Around midnight, she'd said, though she couldn't be sure. I told Lewis to check the college guest log. He nodded, already weary of my certainty. As we left, I glanced again at the desk. The translation lay open under the lamp's indifferent light. A note in the margin caught my eye. 2 words, written faintly in pencil. Love survives. The rest of the phrase had been erased. I felt something stir beneath the logic of the case, a whisper too soft to trust yet. When we stepped outside, the clouds had closed again, sealing the morning back into its grey cocoon. The world, like a mirror, had restored its surface, and all the cracks were hidden behind the glass. I went to St. Fridswide's with the weather clinging to my coat, the porter's lodge smelling of rubbed brass and polite secrecy. Colleges outsource remembrance to stone. People are allowed to fade. The porter on duty, compact and careful, announced that the warden would see us if we did not outstay our welcome, and added a judgment disguised as courtesy. Dr. Marwood had been brilliant until she became difficult. We crossed the quad beneath an undecided sky. In the warden's study, shelves were arranged to appear accidental, a decanter filled for sorrow. Sir Alaric Fane offered a sadness that fitted his chair. A terrible loss to scholarship, he said, and after a pause that tasted of staging, the last months had been challenging. When men begin with regrettably, they have moved their share of regret to someone else's ledger. He poured coffee that smelled of committee. Helena resigned, he explained, after disagreements about the direction of the faculty. I asked whether direction included authorship. Scholarship is collaborative, he said, and the college expects loyalty. Dr. Isabel Kern entered without noise, bringing the crisp air of someone hired to correct other people's summaries. She praised Helena's mind and then, with professional neatness, filed it under difficult categories: impulsive, argumentative, romantically imprudent. I asked whether Helena ever misquoted poets in lectures. Kern smiled with only the mouth. Helena quoted accurately even when accuracy hurt. On the wall hung a photograph I'd seen in Jericho. Here the missing edge was restored. 4 academics in robes, the dead woman turned slightly aside. The 4th figure, young, pleased uneasy, resolved into Dr. Julian Reed, liaison with the Ashmolean. I stored the assessment where one keeps instruments needed later. Leaving the study, I paused at the lodge notice board. A seminar for next Thursday. Chair, Dr. H. Marwood. Institutions are swift when pride is offended, slower when memory is required. I asked the porter about late visitors the previous night. He produced the guest book with practiced reluctance. A gentleman from the Athenaeum at 9, a courier at 10, nothing after. He wrote courier with extra care, as if rehearsing innocence. He admitted the courier wore gloves despite the mild night, and that the scent in the lodge lingered after he left, the sweet, dry trace of a cigar that thought itself discreet. It stayed in my pocket. Lewis walked me along the cloister, building an argument for leaving grief, unanalyzed. Suicide hates interpretation, he said. I told him the warden's language contained a hinge, accepted last month. Yet the board still used Helena's name for next week. In the library, the assistant declared borrowing records private and then fetched them. Catullus, several commentaries, a monograph on Venetian devotional art, a handbook on wills and codicils renewed twice. On a table, a copy of Catullus lay open, a pale bracket beside a line on mirrors and fidelity. Not Helena's hand. The strokes were angular, self-conscious. I put the book back exactly, which is another way of taking it. Through the corridor window the quad looked obedient. Beneath the warden's casement, a crescent in the gravel marked a heel that had paused and twisted. Along the sill, a thin ash moustache the rain had not yet persuaded into honesty. It was not evidence, but it was the shape evidence often wears when it is deciding. At the lodge, the porter remembered something he had carefully not forgotten. The courier had asked whether the warden's study faced the quad or the gardens. It is the sort of question people ask when they intend to look in. I thanked him and wrote my name in the ledger, because colleges prefer ritual to suspicion, and names behave better when penned. Back in the street, the sky considered rain again. Lewis suggested lunch, I said later. The crossword in my pocket offered a clue I had ignored since morning. College keeps face for appearance. 5 letters. I thought of the restored photograph and penciled front in the margin of my mind. Perhaps wrong, perhaps right, but it would do until the next mistake. Oxford creaked softly behind us, deciding which of its memories to keep. It was one of those afternoons that felt indecisive even by Oxford standards. Sunlight rehearsing its exit behind a gauze of drizzle, the streets washed to a dull glow, and the air heavy with the perfume of sodden plane trees. I had brought Helena Marwood's translation home with me, though calling it hers might already have been an assumption. The volume was a ruin of annotations, neat Latin lines translated into something between poetry and self-portrait, a scholar's confession disguised as scholarship. I read without appetite, pausing often to pour another measure of whiskey, the kind that allows thought to unravel just enough. Catullus had never been my companion of choice, but I understood the melancholy of men who write of fidelity as if it were an affliction. Helena's marginalia were spare, private and, more troublingly, consistent until they weren't. About 2/3 through, the handwriting altered, smaller, less certain, the ink darker. A phrase translated one way in the text, and another, contradictory version whispered in the margin. Love survives reflection, truth does not. I wrote it out on a scrap of paper and stared until the words dulled themselves into formality. Lewis had left for the evening, muttering about his wife's patience with cold suppers. I envied his clarity. My own dinner sat ignored, congealing into abstraction. The crossword lay beside the glass, as it always did, and I looked at it without really seeing. A clue lingered unresolved. Glass reveals double life. 6. I tried mirror again, foolishly, but the pattern no longer fit. A reflection that hides as much as it discloses. Perhaps facade. Perhaps specula. The Latin slithered back. Speculum. And I felt that thin stir of coincidence one pretends not to believe in. The next morning, I returned to the house in Jericho. The air had grown stale in only a few days, as though the walls were already re-educating themselves to silence. Among the papers on her desk I noticed a dictionary of classical Latin, open at fragment, torn piece. Her pencil had drawn a small circle around it, faint but deliberate, a word too exact to be innocent. She had written next to it, meaning preserved in damage. I folded the note into my pocket, without yet knowing why. At the station, I telephoned the Bodleian's archive department. The librarian on duty sounded both weary and intrigued, a combination I've always found trustworthy. Helena had indeed deposited a draft of her translation months before her death, marked provisional. I asked for a comparison, and by late afternoon I was seated at a wooden desk beneath a skylight, the color of pewter, the 2 versions spread before me like accusations. The earlier manuscript was colder, stricter. The later one, the one found at her house, shimmered with intrusion. Entire passages had been refined into something intimate, lyrical, and, in places, original, the tone of a woman writing no longer for academia, but for herself, or for someone she wished to persuade. A slip of paper fluttered from the older draft, creased and perfumed faintly of ink and smoke, It contained a single word in another hand altogether. Masculine, forceful. Reconsider. No signature. The handwriting was familiar, though it took a moment to rise from memory. I had seen it in the visitor's book at St. Frideswide's, the warden's confident scrawl, too proud to disguise itself. I returned the papers to their envelopes and sat a while, listening to the soft mechanics of the library, the shuffling of students, the rustle of pages turning toward revelation and away again. When I finally stepped outside, twilight had replaced the day with its more forgiving light. I walked along Broad Street, past the museum steps where pigeons debated eternity, and thought again of that note. Reconsider. A command, not a plea. Men in authority prefer imperatives. I stopped before a shop window, an antique dealer's again, perhaps the same one as before, and watched my own reflection fracture in the curved glass of an old mirror. My face divided itself into fragments that almost aligned, then failed. It struck me, not as deduction, but as recognition, that Helena's translation had not been stolen from her, it had been rewritten. Somewhere between her resignation and her death, her words had been adjusted, her tone altered, her mirror cracked by another hand. I could not yet say by whom or why, but I felt the first faint click of alignment, like a lock beginning to confess its combination. I walked back toward the car. The evening bells began, solemn and inaccurate, echoing across the damp stone. Each note lingered longer than the last, as if Oxford were reluctant to end the sentence. I shared the feeling. It was Lewis who suggested the Ashmolean, though he didn't know why. He rarely does, but he trusts the quiet machinery of instinct, that unscientific cousin of deduction. The postcard we'd found, the fresco of a woman holding a mirror, had been printed for one of the museum's smaller exhibitions a few years back, the kind that attracts more curators than visitors. I remember thinking, as we walked up Beaumont Street beneath the drained light of late afternoon, how Oxford has a particular way of dressing its secrets in culture. A murder in Jericho becomes scholarship by morning. Inside, the air was dusted with the scent of varnish and age, and every sound seemed swallowed by centuries. We climbed the stairs past the marble torsos, those confident fragments of gods who had survived their own worship, and found the gallery almost empty. A guard nodded at me with the muted reverence usually reserved for clergy. The fresco was smaller than I'd imagined, framed under glass, its colors drained but stubborn. A woman gazing into a mirror, her expression unreadable, the reflection showing her not as she was, but as she wished to be. The cracks ran through her throat and across her cheek like the fault lines of a soft rebellion. Dr. Julian Reed appeared from a side door with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to entering scenes already in progress. He was younger than I'd expected, though his eyes carried that subtle fatigue which academia confers instead of experience. He recognized my name before I introduced myself. "Helena spoke of you once," he said, as though testing whether the dead could still embarrass the living. I asked in what context, but he only smiled, that delicate academic smile which promises revelation but delivers commentary. He led us to a desk where photographs were spread like autopsy records. The fresco, he explained, was believed to conceal another image beneath its surface. A second woman painted over, perhaps by the same hand, perhaps later. Restoration was impossible. The pigments were too fragile, the mystery too content to remain so. Helena had been fascinated by it. Obsessed might have been the better word. She wrote an article, never published, arguing that the painting represented deceit preserved in devotion. I asked whether he agreed with her. He said he didn't know, though his tone suggested he'd tried to. Lewis busied himself noting dates and catalogued numbers, an occupation that gave him dignity. I walked closer to the fresco, watching the face dissolve into brushstrokes. Beneath the cracks I could almost sense another contour, a faint suggestion of movement under stillness, like breath caught in plaster. I said aloud, perhaps to myself, that Helena's translation of Catullus carried the same fracture, the elegant surface concealing a second, truer text underneath. Reed looked at me sharply, and I realized I had struck the wrong nerve. He recovered quickly, speaking now of funding, of committees, of how Helena's temperament had made collaboration difficult. The old vocabulary of dismissal. I asked whether she had been difficult before or after she accused the warden of plagiarism. The silence that followed was brief but eloquent. He finally said she had regretted that accusation, that she had been unwell. He added that she'd come to see him the week before her death, to discuss the fresco, and that she'd seemed calm, resolved. I asked whether she'd left anything with him, notes perhaps, but he shook his head. Nothing tangible, he said. Only impressions. The guard reappeared, politely bored, and asked if we'd be long. I told him Aunt rarely cooperates with timetables. As we left, I turned once more to the fresco. The woman's face had changed in the failing light. The crack across her throat seemed deeper, the reflection in the mirror darker. It occurred to me that the painting's secret might never have been hidden under its surface, but in plain sight, an image that lies not by omission, but by precision. Outside, dusk was thickening into the kind of evening that insists on melancholy. Lewis asked whether I believed Reed. I said belief was the laziest form of understanding. He frowned, as he always does when I drift into philosophy, and lit a cigarette he'd been saving for later. The smoke curled upward like a question mark no one wished to answer. As we crossed the road, I caught our reflections in the museum's glass doors, distorted, doubled, almost fused. The mirror again, patient and persistent. A woman who had seen herself twice, a scholar who had written herself out of truth, and a detective too old to pretend he didn't recognize the pattern. Every deception is a portrait, and every portrait, if one waits long enough, begins to resemble confession. That night I took the postcard from my pocket and laid it on the table beside the whiskey. The image had faded further, the mirror almost blank now. I wondered whether Helena had seen that same emptiness and called it peace. I doubted it. But doubt, like art, is often the only honest way of remembering. Lewis and I returned to St. Frideswide's on a day that smelt of wet slate and polished wood. The porter's lodge produced its professional smile. The warden was engaged with donors, which meant available to power, unavailable to trouble. We were shown to a waiting room where the furniture kept its silence. Kern arrived first, papers clamped to her chest like a shield. Grief was complicated here. Helena had been brilliant, but brilliance is a climate not everyone can live in. Who kept keys to the senior common room after hours. She listed names with academic neutrality, pausing when she reached her own. Had she read Helena's latest draft? Not without permission, she said, then corrected the slip. Not without approval. Approval from whom lingered like aftershave. In the corridor, the boards complained the way old buildings warn the inattentive. A junior fellow, too young for his tie, too old for his hope, whispered that the warden and Helena had met privately a week before she resigned. He added that Reed waited in the gardens afterward, face set to patience. The warden granted us 10 minutes and performed candor with professional grace. He lamented the tragedy and implied the inevitability. About plagiarism, he said, misunderstanding. Helena withdrew it. Was there a retraction? He produced a typed letter from a folder curated to impress. The signature was absent, the tone impeccable. She sent it late by courier, he said, and poured water into glasses already nearly full. As he reached for the jug, I noticed a cut by his thumbnail, new enough to announce itself under a translucent strip. Vanity had not allowed a glove. I remembered the ash on his sill and the twist of a heel in the gravel beneath his window. These small survivals began to arrange themselves into a preliminary timeline. We sought colder air in the cloister. Lewis asked whether I was satisfied. Satisfaction is a moral condiment, I told him. Inquiry prefers plainer fare. We visited the archive room, where the librarian guarded her keys like a virtue. Borrowing slips, I asked, and received them after the customary liturgy. Helena's card was crowded, the warden sparse, Kearns neat to the point of self-regard. Reed's entries told a nervous story, catalogues, restoration ethics, and, lately, wills. Near the desk a ledger lay open for binding tallies. A faint smear of ash marked the margin, pressed into the paper as if by a thumb impatient with memory. The room allowed no smoking. I closed the book where the ash would be kept safe from later cleaning. Evidence is sometimes nothing more exalted than preserved carelessness. At the corridor's end, a notice board sagged under activity. A poster announced Mirrors in Classical Literature, Convenor Dr. Isabel Kern. The detachable slip for time and place had been torn away cleanly. My eyes dropped to the floor. A round damp stamp stained the stone, the circumference of a coffee cup. Someone had waited, counting minutes by cooling liquid, rehearsing certainty before entering a room where certainty would be contested. Back at the lodge, the porter offered small truths with large caution. A courier had come late 2 weeks earlier. Gloves, dark coat, the clean smell of expensive tobacco. He used the side door and left by the quad. Did he sign? The book had been upstairs for balancing, so no. Did he look college? He looked like a man accustomed to being expected. In my pocket, the crossword held a clue I had not honored. Keeper of college memory, loses head, becomes secret. 5 letters. I tried archivist and decapitated it to nonsense. Tried warden and saw Arden, which is garden, the place where Reed had waited. The clue wasn't the answer, merely the hint. Remove the head and what remains points to where things are hidden. We left with the light thinning to pearl. Windows brightened like reluctant confessions. Behind us, the college returned to its recital of decent lies. I had no answer, a pressure of shape under the surface, a sentence not yet willing to be spoken, and the sense that the mirror we were offered had been polished to reflect only the viewer. Somewhere behind it, the crack was traveling. I've often envied men who can end a thought cleanly. That night I tried and failed. Oxford looked and offered no counsel. Pieces I had assembled made the kind of pattern that pleases the tired. Reed, the museum man, cornered by accusation, visits Helena, begs or bullies, the evening sours, and he arranges a death that looks like surrender. He leaves pills and a note, wipes a rim, chooses midnight for its modesty. The postcard of the fresco becomes his flourish, a scholar's irony. It pleased the file, the press, and the college's careful conscience nicely. Lewis accepted the shape, if not the shine. "You think the Ashmolean is at the center," he said. I told him the fresco was a mirror with better lighting. Reed feared exposure. The college feared embarrassment. Helena had become inconvenient. Tidy pressures produced tidy endings. Jericho absorbed our footsteps with tact of wet streets. A neighbor leaned from an upstairs window, saying she had seen a tall man leave Helena's doorway late. In the bedroom, a laurel ash had cradled cigar cinders. Reed has that sort of vice, the curated sin of men who polish their vices as carefully as shoes. At the station, we fed the theory into machinery. Duty rosters, telephone records, sign-ins. Reed had left the museum at 9. Kern's seminar ended early. The warden dined with donors until 11. The archive ledger still held its grey thumbprint of ash. "Evidence," said Lewis. I nodded like a man hearing music and deciding it must be his. I returned to Helena's desk because objects keep better counsel than people. Her watch lay beside the translation, stopped at 12:28. I wound it and it ticked instantly, dutiful as a junior clerk. She had been known for punctuality. Such people keep their timepiece fast. Yet the officer's log recorded the kitchen clock at 11:58 when the neighbor called. The numbers would not fraternize. I noted the misalliance. The note troubled me more than it should. Its syntax wore a tie. Its punctuation had been combed. People about to die do not court semicolons. We would send it to a handwriting man, said Lewis. Later, I told him, the pathologist telephoned, therapeutic sedative levels, no undissolved fragments, no residue on the glass. Explainable, I said, hearing how quickly explanations become a net that catches only its maker. I visited Reed without appointment. His office smelled of beeswax and new shame. He arranged regret like a curator arranging fragments. Helena was ill, he said. Committees had made her fierce. Genius abhors minutes. He had loved her, academically and otherwise. His hands, folded, behaved too perfectly. About the postcard, sent months ago, encouragement for a stalled article. About the fresco's supposed underpainting, mystery flatters scholarship and should be left where it belongs. On the way home, the crossword offered kindness. Stage a scene to deceive. 5 letters. I penciled plant and felt an indecent satisfaction. The case set itself like cutlery. Motive, means, opportunity. The cracked mirror in Helena's room became a signature. The laurel ash, a flourish. The late departure, an inevitability. I told Lewis, we have our man. It should have held. Yet a small dissonance persisted, like a bell slightly out of tune. The unsigned retraction letter with perfect manners. The courier's gloves on a mild night. The porter's careful memory of cigar smoke at a door where Reed, for all his vanity, would have hesitated to announce himself. And the watch again, loyally fast in life, obediently wrong in death. By midnight I possessed a solution elegant enough to invite applause and false enough to survive it. I poured a last whiskey and tried to admire the neatness. Rain moved across the window with patience. In the glass, my face separated into 2 almost consenting halves, and in the refusal of their reunion, I heard the case clearing its throat. It came back on a Tuesday that refused to wake. Oxford wore the colour of unpolished pewter, and Beaumont Street smelled of damp programs and yesterday's rain. The call reached me at my desk, an antique dealer off the Cowley Road, voice careful, saying a mirror had been pushed through his doorway at opening time, wrapped in newspaper as if shame were a commodity one could buy by the yard. No message. Only wait. Lewis found me arranging a tie I do not deserve. The shop's bell coughed us into a room crowded with lives that had lost their owners. The dealer gestured to the counter. Venetian, he said, or something that hoped to be. Gilt too bright. One pane fissured in a diagonal too deliberate for chance. We lifted it together. The backboard was newer than the frame. The screws replaced, one only half persuaded. Lewis kept the questions polite. The door this morning, I asked, locked or merely shy? Wedged, he said, with a matchbox to stop the bell. Gloves? Of course. Voice? Only a cough that belonged to habit. A brass paperweight had appeared on a side table by way of consolation, shaped like an olive branch. I turned it over and found a faint smear of wax along the vein. In the quiet that follows, discovery. I loosened the backboard. Behind it a shallow compartment admitted itself with the shy logic of a secret expecting to be found. Inside, folded twice and tied with cotton that had forgotten how to be white, lay pages. Helena Marwood's translation again, but colder, steadier, the English less confessional, the Latin tightened to severity. At the end, a date appeared in the thin hand we had met in her dictionaries. 2 days after the night the college had chosen for her death. Back at the station, I spread the papers and let their chill instruct me. The typed retraction letter to the warden had spoken with immaculate manners. These pages did not. A marginal correction matched Helena's pencil on the word fragment, meaning preserved in damage. I telephoned the pathologist and asked him to quarrel with his own timings. He disliked me for it, which is a tolerable substitute for respect. A clue offered cheerfulness where none was earned. Hide truth in reflection. 7. I tried mask, then stopped. Answers come when their pride has thinned. I left the square blank. Evening fell into the city with practiced grace. I walked to Jericho and let myself into the house that had already begun to forget its owner. In the bedroom, the cracked mantel mirror regarded me without curiosity. The backing loosened under a thumbnail. A shallow envelope had once lived there and was now elsewhere. Its absence was scented faintly with a perfume I could not name, clever and unsentimental. I imagined the olive branch paperweight pressing wax against paper. On the dressing table, her watch lay face down, as though sulking. I turned it over. 30 minutes fast, faithful to habit. The neighbor's telephone call had given a time that disagreed politely with the pathology and insolently with the watch. I felt the case shift, not loudly, but the way a moored boat shivers when the rope slackens. Lewis rang from his kitchen, his supper cooling into duty. Courier records remained a fiction. The porter remembered again the cigar, dry, expensive, self-approving. "What did the mirror say?" he asked. "It said what all mirrors say," I told him. "Nothing. And if you wait, more than that." He called me impossible and told me to sleep. I did not. I read Helena's pages until the words became angles, then looked up to find my reflection waiting, neatly bisected by the diagonal the city had chosen. Somewhere behind the surface, something older kept breathing, as patient as it was unforgiving. I thought of hands in gloves, of a matchbox that hated bells, of wax along a leaf vein, of dates that refused obedience. The college would prefer a tidy ending. The mirror had returned to disagree. When I finally turned off the lamp, the glass held the room a heartbeat longer, as if reluctant to release what it had borrowed. The street outside resumed its reign. In the half-light, my face seemed almost whole. Almost was enough for the night, quite gently. I remember that morning by its stillness. Even the city seemed to wait. Rain had withdrawn to the edges of clouds, and the pavements, recently washed, glistened with an honesty I could not match. The mirror lay in evidence, its fracture catching light like a reluctant confession. Behind its backing we had found Helena Marwood's true translation, the version that had never left her desk, dated days after she was said to have swallowed death so obediently. The words in the margin were faint, uncertain, but enough. A pencil, nothing more. A.F. Lewis said it could be anyone. I told him handwriting rarely belongs to anyone. It betrays the hand, not the name. He looked unconvinced, but there was kindness in his doubt. I've always liked men who hesitate before believing in coincidence. At St. Friddiswide's, the day was rehearsing spring. The porter nodded with the sort of civility reserved for ghosts. We walked to the warden's study, the corridors smelling of linen and quiet wrongdoing. Fane received us with the practiced sorrow of administrators. The tragedy, the loss, the distraction it had caused in college accounts. His hands moved restlessly along the arms of his chair, one thumbnail newly bandaged. I remembered that cut. It had appeared the day of our first meeting. He spoke of Helena in the past tense that people use when they hope their guilt is grammatical. He regretted her accusation, her brilliance, her loneliness. I asked if he'd seen her in the week before she died. He said once, briefly. His eyes traveled to the window as if the truth might be kept there. I unfolded the final page of Helena's translation. I pointed to the margin. A faint mark of graphite, curved just so, trailing into the paper's grain. Fane glanced at it too quickly, then looked elsewhere. I told him I'd compared it to the minutes of the faculty meeting 2 years prior. The same pressure of line, the same self-conscious loop. He said coincidence again, softly, as though auditioning for the role of innocence. Lewis shifted, impatient. He asked why a warden's initials should rest in a dead woman's manuscript. Fane smiled at him the way clever men smile at straightforward ones. Collaboration, perhaps, he said. Guidance. She often asked my opinion. But he was trembling slightly, a rhythm so contained it belonged to music rather than nerves. I noticed the smell of tobacco, faint but precise, the same scent that had lingered in the porter's lodge and on Helena's curtains. The warden asked to see the manuscript again, his tone too polite. When I handed it to him, he held it as if weighing his past. His thumb brushed the pencil mark once, then stopped, a gesture of farewell more than examination. He placed it carefully on the desk and said he hoped we'd find peace in our conclusions. Not justice, peace. Outside, Lewis muttered that we'd have him soon enough. I said soon is the enemy of truth. What struck me wasn't the initials, but what came after them, a faint smudge of erasure, the ghost of a letter rubbed out, perhaps an L or an E. I didn't tell Lewis. Ambiguity is a currency I prefer not to spend too quickly. We stopped by the library before leaving. A student was shelving books, humming a hymn that refused to stay in tune. She said Helena used to sit by the north window, writing notes in margins no one else could read. Sometimes she would laugh at them, as if they were answers to questions she hadn't asked aloud. The student didn't know why that memory mattered, but she offered it like a flower pressed too long between pages. That evening, I walked through the quad alone. The rain had returned discreetly, as though continuing a conversation we'd begun days earlier. From the warden's window, a thin line of light divided the dark, the kind of light that belongs to someone who has not yet chosen between confession and silence. I paused under the archway, listening to the patter on stone, and realized how the case had changed shape without moving at all. Helena's death was no longer a question of who but of when. Whether her ending had arrived that night in Jericho or much earlier, when her words were first borrowed and her voice translated into obedience. I thought of the erased letter beside those initials, a fragment of an apology the paper had refused to keep. Back home, I opened my crossword. A clue stared up at me. One name hides another, 5. I wrote alias, and for the first time that week the answer felt heavier than the question. The rain against the window gave no applause. It simply continued, as rain always does, persistent, impartial, and true. I went back to Jericho at the hour when respectable men begin to doubt themselves. The street had dried into a dim clarity. Inside her house the air had settled, as if the rooms had learned not to expect her. I laid the mirror on the dressing table and watched my face divide along its tidy wound. It is difficult to accuse a reflection. It always agrees. Lewis arrived with impatience folded. "We have enough," he said, meaning we had something that looked like enough. The initials. The courier no one could place. The cigar the college pretended not to smell. He wanted me to move, to declare, to let the machinery grind. Soon, I told him. He left to fetch a warrant that would ask for what everyone already knew. I walked to St. Frideswide's alone. Rain rehearsed itself along the cloister. Upstairs, the warden's door stood ajar, the crack of light across the corridor like a blade that had already chosen its work. He looked older in the half-glow. He began before I asked. She changed the draft, he said. She wanted it to sing, and I told her scholarship was for truth, not performance. The word truth arrived dressed for a ceremony. When? I asked. The week she resigned. Her accusations had been vulgar. The college had suffered. Donors had asked whether diligence had left the faculty. He spoke like a man counting places where he had been wounded. I put Helena's final pages on his desk. The margin waited with its pencil ghost. "Your initials," I said, "or an imitation by someone who admired you too well." He touched the loop with that bandaged thumb and did not remove it. "She wanted to send the book to press," he said. to make me choose between reputation and fact. What did you choose? He stared at the window as if the answer were walking in the quad. He said he went to Jericho that night with a cigar he did not smoke and a humility he could not sustain. He had begged. She laughed. She placed the mirror against the mantel, said it was Venetian, said it knew how to tell the truth twice. She turned to fetch the pages. He reached first. The mirror slipped. The sound, he said, was the sound the world makes when it changes its mind. She fell. There was blood you could almost deny. He spoke softly then. Even lies understand volume. And the note, I asked. The glass, the perfect syntax of surrender. He looked ill with the memory. He arranged them as people arrange flowers for public rooms. Correct, plausible, unkind to nobody in particular. The watch, I said. He blinked. 30 minutes fast. In life, she kept the world early. In death, someone corrected her. He closed his eyes. I thought it respectful, he said, to set it right. Respect is a reliable undertaker of truth. I telephoned Lewis from the study, listening to the click in the line that announces the future. Bring what you've promised, I told him. Then I waited with the warden in a silence that smelled faintly of ash and furniture polish. He asked whether I had ever loved Oxford enough to forgive it. I told him I had loved it enough to remember. Before we left, he asked if he might see the fresco once more. Not tonight, I said. He nodded. In the quad, the rain had discovered commitment. The porter watched us go as if counting minutes on an old clock whose hands no longer agreed. Later, at home, the crossword offered a mercy it did not mean. Break what shows the truth, 7. I saw neither mirror nor shatter. I wrote confide and let the wrongness stand. Some answers prefer to remain misread. They live longer that way. I set Helena's pages on the table and turned the mirror to the wall. My face survived the experiment. Her face had always survived. In the new quiet, I heard the city moving through its rituals, bells bending time to propriety. I poured a measure and did not drink it. The night asked nothing. I allowed it that courtesy. The morning after the confession was not a morning at all, but an echo. Oxford, that patient archivist, had returned to its routines as though truth were an inconvenience successfully filed away. The newspapers carried 3 measured lines about the warden's resignation. Nothing about guilt. Nothing ever is. I walked past St. Fritzwide's before breakfast. The quad was rinsed by an indifferent rain, the stones glistening like conscience after prayer.
I am
Through
Inspector,
the window of his old study,
and I solved
saw the
mystery.
dust
Welcome to
beginning
my new case.
Settle over order. Someone had straightened the books. Someone had removed the ashtray. Helena's manuscript lay in my coat pocket, the pencil marks fading already. At the Bodleian, under the vault of unread time, I handed it to the archivist. She promised safekeeping. I believed her because her voice had that uncorrupted plainness the living seldom manage. As she stamped the receipt, I noticed the small imperfection in the date, an extra dot where ink had bled. Minor errors always survive perfection. Lewis met me outside the Radcliffe camera with 2 coffees he didn't want. He talked of reports, of the Crown Prosecution Service, of motives that fit like borrowed coats. I let him. The city chimed 11, then 11 again. One of those clocks still uncertain after maintenance. He asked whether I was satisfied. Satisfaction, I said, is for verdicts, not for explanations. He smiled, not unkindly, and said I sounded tired. I told him I was only precise. We parted near Broad Street. He walked toward warmth. I toward silence. In Jericho, the blinds of Helena's house remained half-drawn, as if she might return to adjust them. I stood there longer than a man should. Through the glass, the cracked mirror waited on the mantel, its reflection complete again. Someone, Perhaps Lewis, perhaps the landlord, had replaced it with a new sheet. The fracture was gone, but the room inexplicably seemed smaller. I thought of her translation, of that line she wrote twice and meant differently each time. Truth survives reflection, love does not. Perhaps she was wrong. Perhaps both survive only as interpretations, rewritten until the original vanishes. Or perhaps that was what she wanted, to be mistranslated into permanence. A gust caught the guttering above me, spilling a brief glitter of water down my sleeve. I remembered her watch, still 30 minutes fast, and realized that even the dead find ways to hurry away from us. Somewhere, a church bell began to practice its evening. The sound floated, trembled, and lost its direction before finding mine. Back at home, I poured a whiskey I would not finish. The crossword lay open beside the glass. The final clue waited, patient as forgiveness. Wholeness restored by fracture. 5. I wrote faith and felt uncertain whether the answer belonged to the puzzle or to me. Outside, the city turned its lights on one by one, small admissions of fragility against the dark. In the mirror opposite my chair, the reflection held steady, unbroken, indistinguishable from the thing itself. I looked until the difference ceased to matter, and then, because habit is kinder than peace, I closed my eyes and let Oxford continue without me. I keep the mirror turned to the wall. It is a superstition I would deny if pressed, though superstition sits closer to reason than people admit. Oxford loosens into evening with the slow authority of a cathedral closing doors. Rain has washed the streets clean of consequence. Bells warm the air with weary. Mercy. I pour a whiskey and do not drink. Helena's manuscript is no longer mine. The Bodleian keeps it, where moths cannot edit and donors cannot advise. What remains here is quieter. A postcard of a fresco, a watch that will never be corrected again, a slip on which I once wrote, "Truth survives reflection. Love does not," and then crossed out love. Lewis telephones to say the statements align. Mostly. Fane's barrister speaks in tides rather than measures, promising sympathy and context. "You did what you could," he tells me, and invites me to agree. I say nothing. We end the call with the ritual of decent men who share a silence because they cannot share a conclusion. I walk to the Ashmolean. The guard nods, and the stairs welcome my knees. The fresco waits under its glazed air. The woman's face is unchanged. Mine has altered yet remains recognizable, that compromise we call living. Beneath the surface, I do not see the second painting scholars imagine. I think instead of the patient underdrawing in any portrait, a map of intentions the finished work almost remembers. A hairline fissure grazes her painted throat. On a bench, I unfold the crossword. The final clue, saved for stubbornness, reads, "Make peace with what remains." 6. I pencil over several respectable failures before the word resign appears with more honesty than comfort. I do not write it in. Some answers are truer when left potential. Back outside, Beaumont Street glints like a modest river. The colleges breathe their damp erudition. A student runs past with a violin case and the look of someone who has not yet learned that practice and excellence do not always marry. I consider food and choose the long way home. At Jericho, I pause before Helena's window. The replacement mirror reflects a room waiting for another narrative. The mantel holds a small white mark where wax once kept a secret sealed. No one else would notice. I feel that small, disloyal lift of satisfaction that accompanies an observation which arrives too late to be useful. My flat resettles around me with the manners of an old servant. I set the crossword on the arm of the chair and let the city finish its bells. A scrap of penciled notes lies under the lamp. A hurried list from days ago. Watch fast. Courier gloves. Ash on sill. Initials erased, then written again. You almost missed the erased letter, I tell myself. and almost is the cheapest mercy. Before sleep, I turn the mirror toward me. The crack I carry travels invisibly these days. It divides nothing anyone else would value. In the glass, my face behaves. I think of Helena's line rewritten, then rewritten once more. Perhaps truth does not survive reflection. Perhaps it learns to speak differently. Somewhere in the building, a floorboard complains and forgives. Rain begins again with the politeness of a late visitor. I finish the whiskey I promised to ignore. The night offers neither remedy nor indictment. It waits. I set the empty glass down and watch it hold, the room upside down and correct. When I switch off the lamp, the window keeps a final square of gray, a poor man's halo. That is enough. I let it fade quietly.